Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this symposium of the Vidal Sassoon Center, the study of anti-Semitism. You might ask, indeed, why is this night different from all other nights? And I think the answer is to be found at the table with our three participants, all of whom are experts on Japan. And this is the first time, at least in recent memory, that our center has had the opportunity to host a discussion of the question of Japanese anti-Semitism, or more specifically of the protocols of the Elders of Zion in Japan. Before I introduce the three speakers, and in particular our guest for this evening, Professor David Goodman, I want to say a few words of general introduction about the question of the protocols. Not being a Japanese or an Asianist, I leave the specific features of this question to our experts. But I think that anyone who follows with increasing anxiety the state of anti-Semitism around the world will be aware of the fact that the return of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, its current popularity, the scale of its dissemination in certain parts of the world, is a very troubling and important index of current levels of anti-Semitism. I would even venture to suggest that if we look at the history of the last century, the 20th century, we could find a close correspondence in many instances between rising levels of anti-Semitism, particularly of the more deadly kind, and the popularity of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. In other words, there is a close connection between this text and the wider phenomenon of anti-Semitism and its mass appeal. I assume that most people in this room are aware of the bare facts regarding the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that this was essentially a document which we could safely say was a forgery with strong elements of plagiarism, which emerged at the beginning of the 20th century in a very specific milieu in Tsarist Russia, the right-wing, radical, very anti-Semitic milieu. I won't go into the questions which do not need to concern us here at all about who exactly wrote the protocols, why they were written at that particular time. We had a discussion here in June at the Center when we invited Professor Cesare De Michelis from Italy, who discussed exactly those questions, and we published his book about the non-existent manuscript, which some of you may have seen on the table. So there's no need to elaborate that point again. But I think that the Russian origins, the Tsarist Russian origins of the protocols, the fact that it came from a very distinct anti-Semitic milieu with a strong conspiratorial ideology and a belief that the Jews were a danger not only to the system of government and to society in Tsarist Russia, but to the whole world. One of the earliest versions of the protocols by Butmi, in fact, was entitled in Russian, Enemies of the Human Race, and that was in 1906. This is an important fact also for understanding its genesis in Japan, which I'm sure will be referred to later by our speakers. The protocols are purported to be a Jewish document, or something written by Jews for Jews and exposed through devious ways, a secret document that supposedly reveals the way that Jews actually think, almost like an X-ray into the Jewish mind, and its demonic lust for domination. The protocols purport to lay out a plan of the Jewish conquest of the world. And in every country, in every culture where they have taken root, of course, there are some specific national characteristics of how that plan of Jewish conquest is explained and why and to whom it appeals. And about that we will hear more tonight. But the question of Jewish power is one of the central issues that is obviously exposed in any discussion of the protocol. Another issue is the conditions in which the protocols appear to flourish and thrive. If we look at it historically over the 20th century as a whole, times of crisis, of severe strains and stresses in the society, periods of upheaval, convulsions, such as the First World War, obviously the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution particularly, subsequently the Great Depression and the crisis of the 1930s, World War II. In the post-war period, we can think of the Six-Day War and its effect on the Arab world and Muslims. More recently, the First Gulf War, the Second Gulf War, the fall of communism. All these major upheavals and crises seem to have provided a trigger or a catalyst for revised, new versions of the protocol to emerge. And it'd be interesting to examine the specific case of Japan also in the light of what I believe is such a universal pattern. There are questions involving the nature of the demonology of the Jews that is implicit in the protocols, what their sources are, and given the fact that in the case of Europe and Russia, it is evident that the protocols build on a pre-existing tradition, not simply of prejudice, but of demonization of the Jews, the medieval portrayal of the Jews as in league with Satan, as agents of the devil, as Antichrist, an apocalyptic vision of the negative and even diabolical function of the Jews in history. If this indeed has strong medieval Christian roots, then the case of Japan becomes particularly interesting because such roots do not exist in Japan, although of course there are Christians in Japan and that too has importance in the current popularity of or authorship of some of the works that relate to the protocols. And of course there is the question of the Middle East, Israel, America, contemporary issues that we've discussed in other contexts here at the Center. How do Japanese authors of the protocols, how do they see this text in the light of contemporary power relationships, particularly vis-a-vis the Jews, the United States, and Israel? Those are only a few of the issues. Let me now pass to our speakers today. This will necessarily make my introduction rather briefer than I had intended, but let me begin with Professor Goodman. Professor Goodman is Professor of Japanese and Comparative Literature at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in the United States. And he is the author of a number of works, of which one in particular I had read. They aren't very kindly producing it in time. A new paperback together with Masanori Miyazawa, Jews in the Japanese Mind, the history and uses of a cultural stereotype. And I think this was one of the first really important works that tries to come to terms also with the question of Japanese anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Professor Westridge, and thank you for the invitation to come to the Sassoon Center. It's a great privilege to be here, and it's a great privilege to be on a panel with such distinguished colleagues, and I'm honored to have this opportunity. Any Jew who has been to Japan has had a good time. Jews do not experience any particular discrimination in Japan. If a Jew has experiences any discrimination at all in Japan, it's likely to be because he's a foreigner and not because he's a Jew. And this has been historically the case. Generally speaking, the Japanese have had very good relations with the Jews. There was a community of 20,000 plus Jewish refugees in Shanghai during the war, and the Japanese protected them. They did not allow the Germans to harm them. And they lived, the Jewish refugees in Shanghai lived out the war in relative comfort. They had a very rich cultural life. When Japan regained its sovereignty in 1952 after the occupation, it began to establish diplomatic relations with countries all over the world. It established relations at that time with the State of Israel, and it has maintained good and unbroken relations with the State of Israel since that time. I would say good and even improving in recent years. So the question is, what are the protocols doing in Japan? And is it something that we should be concerned about? And why are the Japanese concerned about the Jews? Why did they talk or think about the Jews at all? If relations are so good, and what are we doing here talking about this stuff? It's not particularly pleasant, and I'm sure we all have better things to do on a pleasant, balmy October evening. So why are we here? In the mid-1980s, numerous books based on the protocols of the Elder Zazen appeared in Japan and sold hundreds of thousands of copies, into the millions. In 1987, I wrote an article in the Japanese monthly magazine Sekai criticizing this phenomenon and saying that the protocols are an incitement to murder. Norman Cohen, in his classic pioneering study, called the protocols a warrant for genocide. No less a figure than Heinrich Himmler regarded the protocols as a model for the Nazis, and Hitler sought to emulate and improve upon the ruthless Jewish conspiracy that the protocols described. As Hannah Arendt has written, the protocols presented world conquest as a practical possibility and implied that the whole affair was only a question of inspired or shrewd know-how, and that nobody stood in the way of a German victory over the entire world but a patently small people, the Jews, who ruled it without possessing instruments of violence, an easy opponent, therefore, once their secret was discovered and their method emulated on a large scale. I have come to the position that this is the essence of the protocols. It is not so much the fact that the protocols is aimed at the Jews and that Jews have suffered catastrophically from it and continue to this day to be defamed by it. The essence of the protocols is that it provides a rationale and an organizational model for committing mass murder that can be used by anybody, whether or not they know Jews, have a history of contact with Jews, or have a Jewish population living in their midst. What I want to do today is three things. First of all, I want to explain how the protocols came to Japan. Secondly, I want to talk about how it has been used by a wide range of Japanese for diverse ideological reasons. And third, I want to talk about how it predictably led to mass murder in Tokyo in March 1995. I want to make it clear that this is by no means an indictment of Japan, but a discussion of one subject within Japanese history. Okay, I want to do this as quickly as possible because my time is limited. The protocol came to Japan in about 1920. The Japanese sent a force that eventually reached about 72,000 troops into Siberia as part of what's called the Siberian Intervention, along with troops from the United States, Canada, Czechoslovakia, and other nations, in an attempt to reverse the Russian Revolution. While Japanese troops were in Siberia, they came into contact with white Russian troops who had been issued copies of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion as an explanation for why the Russian Revolution had taken place and why it was so difficult to reverse it. Those soldiers who had been soldiers and other scholars who were attached to the Japanese forces brought those copies of the protocols back to Japan, and that's how they reached Japan. There's a long and very interesting story about the reception of the protocols, but tonight we don't have time to go into that. Maybe during a question and answer session, or maybe my two colleagues will be able to comment on it. In 1920, a partial version called The Jewish Herald was published by a man named Shinichi Tsianosuke, who had been a Russian language instructor in Siberia. He had been trained at the Nikolai Seminary, a Russian Orthodox seminary. And in 1924, the first full translation was published under the title Behind the World Revolution. During World War II, there were two trends, and I think this is an interesting and telling aspect of the story. Domestically speaking, the protocols were used in Japan as a way to control dissent and to ideologically, as part of the ideological war on the home front. And Hirokawa Daiichi, who is a very well-known, liberal, very well-respected historian, recalls in his autobiography, writing the following entry. Stalin, Chiang Kai-shek, Roosevelt, and Churchill are all puppets of international Jewry. The roots of their strategy lie in secret Jewish organizations of Jewish military industrialists, international businessmen, finance capitalists, and members of secret societies, speculators, and the like. Hitler and the Nazis are the saviors of mankind or combating them. Japan has also been victimized by the Jews who initiated the present war. Any Japanese with an ounce of sense knows that we are not the imperialists. Similarly, another Japanese historian, Saito Takashi, recalled during the war, all the knowledge we had about Europe and America was what we could glean from our Western history and world geography textbooks, books describing the Jewish global conspiracy and the Masonic threat were available, and our knowledge was so poor that we readily believed the theories they presented. So domestically, this was taught, it was common knowledge that the Jews controlled the world, that the war was caused by the Jews, that there was an international Jewish conspiracy. At the same time, the protocols internationally had a completely different effect. And another man, Inuzuka Kureshige, who was very learned and a well-known authority in the protocols, wrote on the protocols, wrote what we today would consider anti-Semitic literature was a Navy officer, a Navy captain, who was placed in charge of the refugees in Shanghai because of his supposed expertise on the Jews. But he read the protocols as a philo-Semitic text. That is, he said, these are very powerful. The Jews are a very powerful people. They have immense resources at their command, and what we as the Japanese Empire have to do is to harness this Jewish power and use it for the benefit of the Japanese Empire. After the war, Inuzuka claimed that he was a friend of the Jews, and he used the evidence of his a variety of evidence. Professor Shalomi knows the story better than I do and can perhaps tell it. But used his record of treating the Jews well in Shanghai and his belief in Jewish power and in the status of the Jewish community to prove that he was a friend of the Jews. And he became the president of the Japan-Israel Friendship Society, and he remained in that position until his death in 1965. So there are these two sides to the protocols. The upshot, however, is that the protocols were a part of Japanese culture. They have been in Japan and have been circulating in Japan as long as they have been circulating in the English-speaking world. They're well known. There are many different editions, and they're available. In the post-war period, as the Japanese tried to put the war behind them, they also put the protocols behind them. And so the protocols enter a period of dormancy. But in the 1980s, all of a sudden, they began to appear again. And what I want to do next is offer four portraits of four different people, four completely different backgrounds, who actively used the protocols. The first is Uno Masani, and I'll call him a Christian fundamentalist xenophobe. The second is a man named Yajima Kinji, who I will label a frustrated academic. Maybe there are others like that in this room. Ota Ryu is a left-wing ideologue, and Asahara Shoko, I will call, and I think you'll agree with me, was a religious fanatic. So these are the four people I want to talk about. Uno was the author who was the first to really spectacularly resurrect the protocols in the mid-1980s. In 1986, he published two books that became bestsellers that sold, at the time, a combined total of more than 1 million copies. Uno resurrected and refurbished Japan's xenophobic ethnic nationalism, arguing that Japan had faced a mortal threat from the adherents of an alien occult religion and identifying that threat with the Jews. Uno explained that the trade friction that was going on at the time with the United States was the result of the fact that America was controlled by a secret, all-powerful Jewish shadow government. Japanese-Jewish relations were, in fact, Japanese-Jewish relations, according to Uno. Indeed, as he trumpeted in the title of one of his 1986 bestsellers, if you understand the Jews, you will understand the world. Furthermore, because they had been mandated by the American-drafted post-war Constitution, all of Japan's democratic institutions were nothing more than agencies of the Jewish plot to destroy Japan. Democracy and internationalism were simply the Judaization of Japan, and in response to the Jewish threat, Uno urged his countrymen to emulate Adolf Hitler and devise policies that would protect the interests of the Japanese ethnic nation. the Nindoku no Dieki is the Japanese word. Christian theology also played a role in Uno's thought. He's a fundamentalist Christian minister in the Osaka Bible Christian Church, and he had previously published explicit works of Christian prophecy. In these works, he preached that the ultimate aim of the Jews was to precipitate World War III in order to bring about the Messianic age. As foretold by the prophet Ezekiel, a Soviet... I'm not making this up. As foretold by the prophet Ezekiel, a Soviet invasion of Israel would precipitate the war, which the Jews, you'll be happy to know, would win. A Jewish autocrat would be anointed and benevolently rule the world from the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. But the Jewish dictatorship would only last 3.5 years, after which the real Messiah, the resurrected Jesus Christ, would appear on the Mount of Olives, right here, and usher in the true millennium. Uno's argument closely resembles the apocalyptic theology of the American premillennialist theologian Hal Lindsey, and it seems likely that Uno was aware of Lindsey, whose immensely popular The Late Great Planet Earth was published in 1970 and had reportedly sold 18 million copies by the mid-1980s when Uno was writing himself. The cataclysm Uno predicts is identical to the one Lindsey describes and uses the same as exegetical evidence. Uno Masami's achievement is to have combined Japan's indigenous xenophobia and ethnic nationalism with current trends in Christian fundamentalism and a conspiracy theory that derived from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. In so doing, he achieved both financial success and respectability. His books were advertised prominently in all of Japan's major newspapers. He was quoted in news articles about the Japanese economy, and he was invited by a conservative faction of Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party to speak to a Constitution Day rally in May 1987. Not only did Uno's success embolden others to follow his example, but his notoriety made the protocols of the Elders of Zion and its theory of Jewish conspiracy to destroy Japan and rule the world common knowledge in Japan. Yajima Kinji is my next subject. It's often argued, especially in our post-9/11 world, that feelings of humiliation go far to explain the ideology of terrorism. In the Japanese case, feelings of frustration and humiliation do serve as a justification for the turn of some Japanese intellectuals to the theories of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and I think Yajima Kinji is an example of this trend. He was a very prominent Japanese academic. He taught at a number of very prestigious institutions, including Tokyo Gakugei University, Tokyo Institute of Technology, Aoyama Gakuin University, and even taught at Beijing University as an exchange professor. Yajima was also a well-respected scholar and translator. He translated the works of the important Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek and was an editor of Hayek's works. In 1979, he translated the very important book by John Rawls, the liberal philosopher, A Theory of Justice. This is one of the most influential liberal texts, philosophical texts in the post-war period. As a reliable expert on economic affairs, Yajima was quoted twice in 1987 by Time magazine. Notwithstanding his academic credentials, in 1986, Yajima published The Expert Way to Read the Jewish Protocols, which you see here on the screen. And by 1987, the book was already in its 55th printing. According to Amazon.com in Japan, if you want the book, you can order it and it will be delivered, you'll be happy to know, in 2 business days. In the introduction to The Expert Way, Yajima traces his fascination with the protocols to his experience in the United States in 1972 when he visited during the Nixon-McGovern presidential campaign. He writes that he was invited to participate in a panel to discuss trade friction between the United States and Japan. But when he read the coverage of the event in the Sacramento Chronicle the next day, he was deeply offended by the way the paper described him. Afterwards, he moved from Sacramento to San Francisco, where he visited the Bohemian Club, an exclusive men's club, and there he began to become convinced that the world was not run, as seemed apparent, by institutions and governments, but he decided that it was really run behind the scenes by secret societies of rich and powerful men. In the clandestine reaches of secret groups like the Bohemian Club, individuals, business enterprises, and political parties that appear on the surface to be opposed are in fact working in concert. For Yajima, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was the manual, or the Bible, that details the consensus strategy of these powerful forces that control the world. Yajima was not a stupid man. He understood very well that the Protocols was a forgery, but he accepted this and said, I'll quote, "I think the Protocols is a forgery. But the Jews are the only ones capable of the particular concrete expressions in the Protocols regarding ideology, politics, economics, and religion. Consequently, the Protocols were either written by someone more familiar with the Jews than the Jews themselves, or, if that is not the case, then it was put together from the results of all the research ever done on the Jews. In either case, there is no doubt the content consists of the wisdom of the Jews." This is an argument that Adolf Hitler also made. So it's I think ultimately Yajima's expert way to read the Jewish Protocols is a response to the sense of humiliation, frustration, and the inferiority and complex engendered by his encounter with the United States. Despite his scholarly achievements, the world remained quite opaque to Yajima until he discovered the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which gave him a simple explanation, which was a convincing explanation of what was really going on beneath the surface. The Protocols helped to salve his bruised ego by revealing that he was the victim of a racist conspiracy that was at the root of world politics. Ota view, I would categorize as a new left ideologue. If Yajima is a centrist, is a liberal, classical liberal, Ota is very definitely a member of the right. The German sociologist August Bebel coined the phrase "the socialism of fools" to describe the activities of those who blame Jews for the world's ills instead of the real culture of capitalism. Bebel would have applied the phrase to Ota, whose career reflects the steady degeneration of the Japanese left in the world in the years since World War II. I'll go through this very quickly. Ota was born in 1930. He joined the Japanese Communist Party in 1947. In the wake of Khrushchev's revelations of Stalin's crimes in 1956, he left the party and founded the Trotskyist League of Japan, which was the immediate forerunner of the League of Revolutionary Communists, Kakyodo, which is a very important organization, which Ota founded with several other people in December of 1957. Kakyodo was the immediate forerunner of the two most important New Left sects of the 1960s, Kakumaru and Chukaku, which in the late 1960s and the early 1970s engaged in internecine warfare, known in Japanese as Uchigeba, which resulted in hundreds of violent clashes annually and caused numerous deaths and injuries. This sectarian warfare disgusted the Japanese public and contributed importantly, I think, to the general loss of sympathy for the left in Japan in the 1970s and beyond. Calling himself a pure Trotskyist in Japan, Japanese Junto, Ota left Kyoto in July 1958, and in the 1960s he was a very active ideologue. But in the 1970s, as the fortunes of the Japanese left began to wane, he moved on to other causes. For one thing, he championed a revolution for Japan's indigenous Ainu minority. And then he turned to calling for an ecological revolution and became very, very active in the ecology movement. He promoted what he called Tenji no Gaku, which demands the repentance of the human race for despoiling the environment. He calls humans the enemies of the earth and calls for peaceful coexistence of all species throughout the universe. Certainly a sentiment that I don't think anybody here would disagree with. He also had parliamentary ambitions, and in 1990 he ran unsuccessfully for a seat in the lower house of the Japanese Diet. Ota is a prolific author, and if you look his name up on Amazon or on the Kinokuniya book web, you will find about 80 titles attributed to him, either as the author or translator. Before 1991, Ota's books focused primarily on Marxist theory, and to a certain extent on ecological issues. After 1991, he turned his attention to the occult and the Jews. In 1991, he published The Principle of UFOs and Celestial Civilization. His first book about the Jews, also published in 1991, was The Global Strategy of the Seven Great Jewish Cartels. And since that time, since 1991, Ota has published at least one book a year with the word Judaea in the title, and many more volumes of conspiracy theories that deal with the Jewish threat. This is an example which says that the Jewish conspiracy to invade Japan, the Jewish invasion of Japan, goes back 450 years to the middle of the 16th century. In another instance, he claims that the Jewish invasion of Japan has been going on since the Nara period, that is, since the 8th century, so you can take your pick. Helpfully, Ota has also produced numerous translations, including in 2003, Martin Luther's classic anti-Semitic text, The Jews and Their Lies. He's also translated the works of American conspiracy theorists and anti-Semites Eustace Mullins and John Coleman. Ota has also experimented with electoral politics, having founded the Society for Global Restoration, which is Chu Ishinkai, which I surmise is identical to the Global Restoration Party, Chu Ishinto, which fielded candidates in the 1992 upper house diet election on a platform opposing, quote, the ambitions of the Jews, Pharisees, to conquer the world and turn it into a global pasture for the human race. Although the Global Restoration Party polled only 11,883 votes, or a minuscule 0.03% of the electorate, it was the first time since 1942 that a candidate for public office had run in Japan on an overtly anti-Jewish platform. This is a poster that also appeared in 1992, not for Ota's party, but for a similar group called the League of National Socialists. And you can see above the letters NSADP, NSDAP is the phrase protect the environment. And so you have this sort of morphing ecological politics into anti-Semitic politics. And this is just there's just a sort of general degeneration of left-wing politics from a kind of Stalinist, orthodox, communist position through the New Left into a whole melange of different causes, and ending up with this politics based on the protocols of the Elders of Zion. And Oda is not alone in this. Another figure is Hirose Takashi, and I'm sorry that this is not clear, but this is a chart published in a quite respectable twice-monthly magazine called Sapio, which purports to explain how the Rothschilds control everything in the world, the media, the military, governments, and politics. Hirose is a man with impeccable left-wing credentials. He's also the editor of a book titled The Jews, Merchants of Diamonds and Death. So this is not, Oda is not sui generis. There are plenty like him. Finally, Asahara Shoko is my religious fanatic. As you can see by the foregoing, by the mid-1980s, the protocols of the Elders of Zion and the theory of an international Jewish conspiracy to destroy Japan and control the world had been popularized in Japan. Many people had written about it. It was basically common knowledge. And its central contentions were widely circulated. They were available in best-selling books. They were available in periodicals with large circulations. They appeared in large, gaudy advertisements in daily newspapers with circulations of 9 or 10 million copies a day. A political party had been formed and candidates had run for office on a platform drawn from the protocols. The protocols' conflation of Jews and Freemasons, the calumny that Jews control the media and manipulate world governments, these were frequently repeated, and the identification of the United States as a Jewish nation was widely disseminated and to some extent believed. Into this milieu appeared Asahara Shoko. Born Matsumoto Chizuo in Kumamoto in 1955, Asahara was legally blind from birth. But having partial sight in one eye, he nevertheless had an advantage over the completely unsighted pupils at the schools for the blind to which he was sent, and he had high intellectual aspirations. After failing it once, he moved to Tokyo in 1977 to try a second time, also unsuccessfully, to pass the entrance examination for Tokyo University. He was always interested in the occult, and he joined Agonshu, a neo-Buddhist sect, in 1981. In 1982, he was convicted of selling herbal medicines without a license. In 1984, he founded Om Shinsen no Kai, the Om Mountain Hermit Society, the forerunner of Om Shindikyo, the Om Supreme Truth sect. Asahara's transformation from a simple charlatan to a megalomaniacal guru came in 1985, when he claimed to have received the vision that defined his mission. In January 1986, he made a short trip to India and announced on his return that while in India, he had achieved enlightenment. It should always be so easy. In 1987, he changed the name of his sect to Om Shindikyo, and in 1989, it was recognized as a tax-exempt religious corporation by the Japanese government. Asahara immediately began his quest to achieve salvation through a world-encompassing apocalypse. In 1989, he published From Annihilation to Emptiness, Metsubo Kara Kokue, the book as journalist, he published the book in 1989, In February 1990, he stood for election to the lower house of the Diet. But like Ota Ryu, who ran in the same election, he was disastrously defeated, polling only 1,783 votes. Stymied at the polls, Asahara devised other ways to implement his plans and hosted an Armageddon seminar on Ishigaki Island in the Ryukyu chain in April to begin acting out his apocalyptic vision. Ohm began experimenting with weapons of mass destruction the same month by launching an unsuccessful botulism attack in Tokyo. 2 years later, Asahara and members of the Ohm leadership visited Zaire in Africa in an attempt to acquire the Ebola virus. In 1993, Ohm began the large-scale production of sarin nerve gas and acquired an army surplus helicopter in Russia, presumably to use as a delivery vehicle. On June 27, 1994, Ohm released poison sarin gas from a truck in Matsumoto, a city west of Tokyo, and this was, as Robert Lifton has pointed out, the first large-scale, non-military use of nerve gas anywhere on Earth. 7 people were killed and hundreds injured. Then on March 20th, 1995, members of Ohm released sarin gas on the Tokyo subway system, killing 12 people and injuring more than 5,000 others. In Asahara's paranoid view, Ohm was merely responding in kind to the diabolical threat posed by a global conspiracy out to destroy the sect. The overarching theme coloring Asahara's entire view of the world, the scholar Ian Reader explains, was the notion that a vast conspiracy bent on world domination was seeking to destroy Ohm as part of its fiendish plans. Ohm was the only force left standing between the conspirators, who included the United States and Japanese governments, the Freemasons, the Jews, and numerous others, and their evil intentions. This concatenation of Freemasons, Jews, and world governments in a global conspiracy had no other source in Japan other than the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. 3 months before its attack on the Tokyo subway, Ohm made its indebtedness to the Protocols even more explicit. The January 1995 issue of Vajra Asaka, which you see on the screen, its organ publication featured a 95-page manual of fear that quoted liberally and at length from the Protocols and officially declared war on the Jewish world shadow government, which it asserted was plotting to, quote, murder untold numbers of people and brainwash and control the rest. Despite its rhetoric, Ohm was not concerned with Jews per se, however. Rather, it targeted, this is the declaration of war, by the way. Despite its rhetoric, Ohm was not concerned with Jews per se. Rather, it targeted the Japanese elite, whom they defined as Freemasons, and therefore as Jews. And in the manual of fear, you have this rogues list. These are some of the most prominent people in Japan. This is the Emperor, the Empress, the Empress's father, and others. In other words, this is the international elite. Ohm's gassing of the Tokyo subway in the international center of quote-unquote Jewish power in Tokyo was, in its own way, a logical consequence of its view of the world. And this is the aftermath. I think that there's a direct line, in other words, between the spread of the protocol, its popularity in Japan, and this incident of mass murder. Today we live in a world where it is no longer primarily governments and states which threaten terrorism. Now, that's not to minimize the threat of state terrorism. But I think that the really scary threat is from fringe groups who are armed with a homicidal ideology and weapons of mass destruction. And the first really successful such incident was this gassing of the Tokyo subway in March 1995 by the Aum Supreme Truth sect. So I think the Japanese example is instructive in a larger sense. It suggests that real-world experience with Jews or involvement with real political controversies like the Arab-Israeli conflict are not required for people to be seduced by the protocols or to discover in it a motive and means to commit violence. Like the Communist Manifesto, the protocols is available in the world environment, and people in any culture, regardless of their knowledge or experience of Jews, can, and I regret to say probably will, use it. Thank you.
My parents were born in Poland. I don't know if you've had Polish at home. I certainly did. It's my mother tongue. How one moves from Poland to Japan is, of course, another question. But I think that Professor Ben-Ami deserves a medal, not least for the fact that he has been teaching at this university since, if this is to be believed, since 1971, which means 33 years, which could be a world record. I don't know. But it's certainly an impressive achievement, and we certainly know as well that his lectures are immensely popular. Probably the biggest part of the Elihu University come to listen to him on Japan, which is a very interesting fact about Elihu University. His subject has such resonance, and I'm sure that owes something to his endeavors. I myself learned a great deal from reading his book on the Japanese and the Jews, and it's only one of a number of works. I'll just mention two. One about politics and culture in wartime Japan, which was published by the OUP, and more recently in Japanese. Did you actually write this in Japanese? You wrote it in English, but it appears only in Japanese? The title is Hahanaru Tenno. Hahanaru Tenno, for those of you who don't understand Japanese, is the emperor as mother figure. And that is very intriguing. Tokyo, 2003. And I should also mention that at the turn of the millennium, or shortly after, in November 2000, the Emperor of Japan bestowed on Ben-Ami the Order of the Sacred Treasure, Gold and Silver Star. Well, that's something. So, please.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, David Goodman, for the illuminating presentation. Now, much of the discussion about the protocols has been devoted to the question of their authenticity. Whether it's a forged document, and time and again people have been showing that it's a forged document and therefore invalid. But it seems that the question of their authenticity, especially in Japan, probably in other countries of East Asia too, does not bother the people very much. So even if we prove that it's a forgery, they say, okay, it may be a forgery, but it really reflects what the Jews want to do and what they are doing in the world, and that's why we don't care whether it's a true document or a forgery. If so, why are they so popular in the world, and as we just heard in East Asia? Because they offer a very simple and seemingly convincing explanation to a very complicated world, for very unsophisticated people who are quite tired of the very sophisticated explanations that we give them about what happens in the world. And here we have something very simple. There is a group which controls the world, which wants to gain more power, more riches. So it's part of the conspiracy theories that we find in the world. And it's not only about the Jews. You know, the world is full of conspiracy theories, of plot theories. It's very simple, it's very convenient, it's very useful for many people to use conspiracy theories to explain very complicated international and economic and social situations. Now, the tendency to believe in these conspiracies or plots grows when there is some sort of a small, strange group that is a little bit hidden but very influential. So the Jews are such a group, but not only the Jews. We just heard about the Freemasons. Quite often, especially in Japan, when they speak about the Jews and the Freemasons, because both are sort of strange groups that who knows what they are plotting and what they are thinking. Now, such theories, especially about a Jewish plot to rule the world, became very popular in the West, in the Christian West, in Europe, United States, where there are deep religious anti-Semitic roots in Christianity. There are deep social roots, social friction with Jews. There are deep economic roots of economic competition, and sometimes even political roots, anti-Semitic parties. But in Japan, all these roots do not exist. There is no religious root to Japanese anti-Semitism. The Japanese cannot tell the difference between Jews and Christians. And from the Japanese perspective, the Japanese distance, the Jews and the Christians believe in more than the same religion. Now, we can laugh at it and say how stupid they are, they don't understand. But is it really so stupid? I mean, from the Japanese point of view, if we go that far as Japan, Judaism and Christianity are actually one religion, because they believe in the same God, in the same Old Testament. The differences between Judaism and Christianity that we think are so important are smaller than the differences between some Buddhist sects in Japan. There are some Buddhist sects, Zen, you could say, and Shinshu Buddhism, that are more different from each other than Judaism and Christianity, and still we call them Buddhism. So, it's not that strange and stupid on the part of the Japanese to regard Judaism and Christianity as the same religion. So, there are no religious groups, except for Christians, but Christians are a very small group in Japan. And the anti-Semitic people within the Christians are, again, a very small minority. And of course, no social rules. There was never social friction between Japanese and Jews. And as Professor Goodman just explained, Jews were never molested in Japan, never attacked in Japan. I mean, personally, even during World War II, there were Jews in Japan. There were Jewish musicians performing in Japan. There were Jewish students in Japanese universities. They came from Manchuria, but still, they were Jewish. The Japanese never heard them. I mean, these were foreigners. And if they carried, let's say, German passports, some of these musicians, they were German citizens. They came to Japan as Germans. But then the German government abolished German citizenship, but the Japanese did not accept it. They said they came to us as Germans. We should treat them as Germans. They didn't care about them being Jewish. So, no social friction with Jews, no economic friction with Jews. I mean, there's no Jewish minority in Japan. There's no competition between Jews and Japanese. These were foreigners, Western foreigners in Japan, and of course, no political roots. And even the very definition of a Jew in Japan is very problematic, and it's problematic too here. In Japan, I mean, who is a Jew for a Japanese? How does a Japanese define a Jew? It's very difficult for him to define. Jewish Westerner, many Japanese would say that any rich and smart Westerner is a Jew. Because that's what's Jewish. Being a Jew means that you are rich, you are smart, you're influential. So, if he happens to carry a cross, it doesn't matter for the Japanese. He is a Jew. In Japan, the Jews were regarded not only as Westerners, but as very peculiar Westerners. But not the Jews that they confronted personally. It was an idea, sort of very general idea, that there is such a group in the West called the Jews. They dominate the West. Now, and these Jews are actually the epitome of the West. The most Western side of the West, which means that everything that the Japanese admired in the West, that the Jews represented everything that the Japanese admired in the West, but also everything that they hated in the West. So the Jews reflected both. For instance, the Japanese admired, and they still admire, many, many things in the West. They admire the riches of the West. The Jews are super rich. They admire the intelligence of the West, the scholarship of the West. So the Jews are super intelligent, super learned. So I would say Rothschild and Einstein. We just heard for Rothschild. These are the typical Jews of the Japanese. And also one can say Kissinger, because he was influential, he was strong. But also the Jews reflect the bad things of the West, or that the Japanese hate and fear in the West. Like, for instance, the greed of the West, materialism of the West. So the Jews are also very materialistic, only interested in money. So when the Japanese say Jewish, it means something materialistic, greedy, also deceit. The Jews are crafty, they're not very honest, the practices are dishonest, because that's what they think about the West. And the Jews are the, let's say, caricature of the West, or the epitome of the West for the Japanese. The Japanese accepted anti-Semitism as a theory, together with all Western theories. There's hardly any Western theory that was not accepted in Japan, either by most Japanese or by few Japanese. The Japanese were very eager to accept any theory that they found in the West. And anti-Semitism in the late 19th century and 20th century was part of Western civilization. So when the Japanese adopted Western civilization, they also adopted anti-Semitism. They adopted Shakespeare, they adopted The Merchant of Venice. It went together. So it reached Japan, it struck roots in Japan, but because there were no deep religious, or there were no religious or social or economic roots for this anti-Semitism, it all remained on a very sort of intellectual level, as a literary genre. And not only that, it was also interpreted in a different way than in the West. So if we take again the protocols, in the West it's a sinister book. It is a part of Jews' hatred. It produces hatred for Jews. I mean, it stems from hatred of Jews, and it produces hatred of Jews. So those who read them and who believe them become haters of Jews. I mean, this is something that we all believe and we all accept. But it was not so in Japan. In Japan, this anti-Semitic literature that showed the Jews that they dominate the world, or they at least try to dominate the world, made many people admire the Jews. They're so rich, so smart, so crafty, and they probably are dominating the world, or going to dominate the world. Maybe we should befriend them. maybe we should learn from them, maybe we should join forces with them. So all these so-called experts from the Jews, that we just heard about them, Yasue and Izuka and others, on the one hand, they promoted this anti-Semitic literature. They translated parts of the protocols. They believed in the protocols. On the other hand, they recommended friendship to the Jews. So they took anti-Semitic assumptions and drew out philo-Semitic conclusions. A phenomenon that we hardly find in the West, or maybe don't find in the West at all. And some people would say it was immoral for them, or there's sort of moral duplicity in being both anti-Semitic and philo-Semitic. How can you be both anti-Semitic and philo-Semitic? The Japanese so-called anti-Semitic writers have proven that you can be, at least in Japan, there's no contradiction of being anti-Semitic and philo-Semitic. You can play with these things. You know, personally, Yasue, who was an expert on the Jews, he visited Palestine in the 1920s, he visited the Hebrew University, and he wrote how beautiful it all is and how nice it is. I mean, a lot of admiration for the Jews. But then, of course, it's part of the Jewish power, part of Jewish influence in the world. Not only that, but this belief in the protocols made the Japanese save the Jews, which is also very strange. I mean, the Japanese saved the Jews in World War II because they believed in Hitler's anti-Semitism. Because Hitler said that the Jews control both the West, I mean, capital states and communist world, and but when Hitler said that, he meant that he should kill the Jews. Now, those people in Japan who believed Hitler, that the Jews control the world, their conclusion was just the opposite. That Hitler is stupid. Because if the Jews are so strong and so powerful, you should not go against them. You should join them. You should control the world through them, not against them. So, the Japanese, in World War II, saved thousands of Jewish lives. In Shanghai, as we have heard, of course, in other places, not because they liked the Jews, not because they were very humane toward the Jews. You know, there's now some literature about the Sugihara thing, you know, how this person was humane. But it was not something that Sugihara did. This is the policy of the Japanese government. And the policy was to allow the Jews enter Japanese controlled territories, even enter Japan, in order to use their power. They believed that these people had a lot of power, and Japan should use this power for its own benefit. Now, I brought here the protocols of the Elders of Zion in Japanese. And so we speak so much about it, maybe you would like to have a look at it. So, this is how it looks. It is called Yudaya Giteisho. But it's called Japanese Furigana, which means how to read it actually. So Giteisho means protocols, but in Furigana it says protocolo, in order to make you believe it's protocol. It has both the Japanese version and the Russian version of the Sergei Milus. It is a translation by Kubota Eiji. It was translated in 1938 by Kubota Eiji. It was published, this is the second edition, in 1940. It was republished in 1959, and this is 1973 printing, the seventh printing, so it went until 1973 into 7 printings. Now, when you open the book, first you see photographs. Now, who is in these photographs? At first we see royalty, British and other European royalty, kings, and it says these kings, European kings, and it starts with Edward VII. It's the first photograph, one whole page of Edward VII, and it said all of these are Freemasons. So it didn't say they're Jews, they're Freemasons. So again, you see Jews and Freemasons are the same. And then it has a picture of 9 American presidents. All of these are Freemasons. So, you say Jewish plot? Maybe, but this is a Freemason plot, right? European kings and American presidents are all Freemasons. Then it has pictures of prominent Jews. Who are the prominent Jews? Of course, Rothschild. But there's Einstein, there's Trotsky, and there's Columbus, and there is President Roosevelt. All of these are Jews. Now, does this mean that the Jews are bad? Maybe, because Roosevelt was the enemy. Einstein was very much admired in Japan. And no Japanese ever had a bad opinion of Einstein. Columbus, maybe because he tried to conquer, or he produced this accomplishment of the American continent. But the most interesting picture is here. It shows a group of Jews raising their fists, and it says, a group of Jewish patriots, let me say, or Giyuhei, or militia, or brave young people protesting protesting Hitler's brutalities. Now it says protesting Hitler's brutalities in 1938. I'm not sure whether the pictures were in the 1938 edition or 1954 edition, but anyway, it's one of the editions, at least in the 1959 edition, showing Jewish patriots protesting Hitler's brutalities. I wouldn't say this is an anti-Semitic picture, right? It uses brutalities. Now, how did this book come to my possession? It's a very interesting story. I didn't buy it. So you think he went to buy the protocol, so I did buy it. But in 1978, a group of Japanese businessmen came to visit the Hebrew University, headed by a businessman called Nishiyama, and they very much were impressed. I mean, it was the first time in Israel they went and visited factories in kibbutzim, then they came to the university, and they had a little party for them. And then Mr. Nishiyama rose up and said, "We want to thank you for all your hospitality. And we saw how beautiful Israel is, and what great miracles you have done in Israel. We admire you very much. We didn't know anything about the Jews. We didn't know anything about Israel before we came here. So we thought we'd buy some books and we'll read them on the plane." Someone recommended to us this book. We read it on the plane, and we found how true it is. When we came to Israel, we saw everything that is written in the book is true. Now we admire you even more. And he said, now I want to leave this book with you as a present. He signed his name, dedication, and he gave it to me. So here you see a Japanese businessman today, what he thinks about the protocols of the society. Now, this is not only this book. Here I brought another book called Judaya no Shoho, Jewish Business Practices. Sounds very anti-Semitic, right? And the author is Fujita Den, very successful Japanese businessman. He passed away recently. He established McDonald's Japan. Now, if you were in Japan, you see how successful McDonald's is in Japan. So he became very rich. And he thought he should tell the Japanese people about Jewish business practices. And he writes about the greediness of the Jews, and how the Jews sometimes cheat, and how the Jews are materialistic, and how what they say is not always trustworthy. So he would say, this is anti-Semitic literature, right? Because that's what anti-Semitic would be saying all the way. But Mr. Fujita Den says, these are the practices that I recommend to the Japanese. He said, in this hostile world of today, if you want to survive, you should be like the Jews. This is the only way of international economic success. But there were some Jews who said, but still you are anti-Semitic because this is how we describe the Jews. He said, I regard myself as a Jew because this is the way I've been practicing. That's why I became so rich. And there is a chapter in this book about himself. And he calls himself Ginza no Yudaijin. I am a Jew of the Ginza in Tokyo. So, is this anti-Semitic literature? On the one hand, yes, because it shows the Jews in such a bad way. On the other hand, no. Great admiration for the Jews, and he recommends it to the Japanese. Now, even if you take Uno Masami, the great anti-Semitic writer that Professor Goodman just mentioned, this Uno Masami whenever he's accused of being anti-Semitic, he says, no, I admire the Jews, I admire Israel, I love Israel. And when people, are a bit suspicious, say, oh, does he say so? However, then he produces a photograph. Photograph is Menachem Begin. He came to Israel, somehow went to a party where Menachem Begin was there. There was a photographer, he has to be photographed with Begin. And he said, I admire this person, he's my model, Menachem Begin. So, of course, he's anti-Semitic, but from what he is writing, on the other hand, you can say he's not exactly anti-Semitic. And of course, as Professor Goodman has mentioned, from time to time, there are sort of states of anti-Semitic literature in Japan. And this is whenever Japan is in confrontation with the United States. It was in World War II, it was 1980s during the trade friction with the United States. Now, why do these periods produce anti-Semitic literature? Because from the Japanese point of view, it's not logical that the United States should be against Japan. Because they think, if we are so good and so nice, why should the Americans be against us? So they need some explanation. Here the explanation says, no, it's not the Americans. It's the Jews behind the Americans. If you look at the Japanese wartime press, quite often it says, it's not a war between Japan and the United States. It's a war between Japan and the Jews. So there's some very strange Jews in the United States who pull the rings. And in Japan today too, whenever there is such a wave, there's anti-Semitic literature. Now, there's less of anti-Semitic, anti-American feeling, and less literature, such literature. Should we be alarmed with this literature, with this type of literature? I don't think so. I think it's more benign than we at first think that it is. First of all, it's not considered highbrow literature. So it is intended for very simple, very sort of little educated people. It's part of a general literature of occult. The Japanese love occult. Like, for instance, Nostradamus. The visions of Nostradamus, the prophecies. This has been a great bestseller in Japan until today. This is part of this kind of literature. You have many bookstores who sell it. You read it on the train, you throw it away when you get off the train. You forget about it. You don't really believe in these things. Now, one can ask, how do you know? Maybe they do believe in it. So, in November 1988, the Anti-Defamation League of neighboring United States, and all of you know, was very much interested in this very question. How does this literature influence the Japanese? So they asked the Japanese branch of Gallup to conduct a public opinion poll and to find out what do the Japanese think. 1988, it was the height of this literature. Now, what did this poll find out? Very interesting finding. First of all, 80% of the Japanese public never heard about this literature. Never heard about it. So it was beneath their interest, as most Japanese never heard about other strange things in Japan. Only 20% knew something about such a literature. So how about this 20%? So they asked, after you have read one of these books, like Kuno-Masami's and other protocols, has this changed your opinion, or did you become more hostile to the Jews after you read it? Only 6% of the 20 said yes, it made us, be antagonistic to the Jews. Which means that most of them, even when they read it, they did not produce anything in them. It's like the visions of Nostradamus. What do you make of it? You read it, you say, it may be interesting, but who knows? That's why I think we should differentiate between this literature in Europe, where it really has a great impact, or in the Middle East, in the Islamic world, and Japan and probably also other East Asian countries, where it's very, very marginal. Although we have heard that the protocols are very influential in Japan, I wonder how many Japanese, if you meet, maybe everyone of you have some Japanese friends, and ask them, do you know anything about the protocols? Have you read it? Do you know what it is, the protocol? My guess is very few Japanese even say that they ever heard about this word. And of course, the second reason that I don't think we should be alarmed is that sometimes, and quite often, people who read it become friends of Israel. As we just heard, the Friendship League of Israel was headed once by such a Jewish expert who translated protocols and wrote their anti-Semitic books. And even today, I met many of these people in the present day, Israel-Japan Friendship Associations. Many of them joined. Why did they join these associations? Israel is not very popular in Japan. Why should a member of the Diet join such an association? Now the reason is because they believe in Jewish power. They believe in what the protocols are saying, that the Jews control the United States. The Jews control much of the world economy. So they should join it in order to learn from the Jews and also to use this Jewish immense power for themselves. And maybe we should compare it to the Japanese attitudes toward demons. Demons, we say, demonization, wow, the Jews are demons. But in Japan, demons are cute. The Japanese don't regard the demons as very sinister. There's no setting. There are many demons. One of them said demons are like a god, like a kami. Now these demons are all around us. And they can be very beneficial if we treat them well. They can be very dangerous if we mistreat them or we ignore them. That's why the Japanese all the time have these ceremonies for the gods and for pacifying the demons. And that's what they think about the Jews. They're like a demon, very strange, very something spiritual, but if you treat them well, very beneficial. If you mistreat them, it can be extremely dangerous. Now, I'll finish with, again, a personal story of mine. And this happened in 1982, immediately after the war in Lebanon. I was in Japan, and I came across a little brochure of a new religious group. In Japan, religious groups, every year, there are new religious groups, all the time. All they're made in Japan, and it's very easy in Japan to establish a new religion. So this was a new religion headed by a woman calling herself, it was a shaman woman, shaman woman there, calling herself Ryugu Otohime, the princess of the sea dragon, and there was a little brochure. Now I am very much interested in Japanese new religions, since I was a student. Professor Bobrovsky taught me once about Japanese new religions, so I was interested in it. I opened it, and I said, wow, it is about the world situation. And it says, the world is in a great tragedy. Wars, revolutions, violence in the world. So this is the first sentence. Second sentence, what is the reason that there are so many tragedies in the world? So many wars, so many revolutions, so much bloodshed, so much suffering. What's the reason? And the answer was the Jews. And I became even more interested in, wow, you have a new religion, anti-Semitic, right, saying that the Jews are responsible for all the bad things in the world. The next question was, why do the Jews commit so many bad things in the world? Why do they cause so much suffering in the world? And the answer was, because in the past, something very bad was done to the Jews. The Jews were treated very badly in the past. The Romans destroyed their temple, they were dispersed in the world. So the angry spirit of the Jews, this is a very Japanese idea, that a person who was killed, was killed wrongly, because he was innocent and was killed by some bad person, his angry spirit takes revenge on your angry spirit. So the reason is that the angry spirit of the Jews cannot have rest until it takes revenge on the whole world. So the angry spirit of the Jews is causing all these troubles in the world. This is a very religious approach, because it's a religious sect. So a religious explanation. The last question was, how can we pacify this angry spirit of the Jews? What can we do? And the answer is, we should be very nice to the Jews. We should help them. We should be pro-Jewish. We should help Israel. So, anti-Semitic beliefs produce, on a religious level, a very philo-Semitic attitude. And this, I think, is very symbolic of what the Japanese think about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think quite remarkable account, which leads me really with two brief reflections. One is that perhaps we should completely change our strategy as Jews and Israelis in dealing with the problem of anti-Semitism. It's obvious that we've been barking up the wrong tree completely. It's very unfortunate members of the Global Forum have been discussing this question for 2 days now in Jerusalem. Did not choose to reflect on the Japanese case, because the logic of what he described is that from now on, not only should we admit finally to the world, A, we do rule the world, we are very powerful, and it would be a very good idea for the rest of the world to start behaving like the Japanese and try to pacify us. We might be a lot more successful. We've never tried it. It's worth a try. And you've also confirmed me in my predisposition to visit Japan as soon as possible. Because if this is a country that actually admires Jews for being smart and rich, and also, you know, even interested in literary ways of anti-Semitism, this is the place. This is a place for Israelis and Jews to go, particularly in the current climate. We should be looking towards Asia. I'm convinced of that. Turn our backs on Europe. Let's start looking towards Asia, because they have the right attitude. With those thoughts in mind, I want to turn to our last respondent, Professor Rotem Kovner, who is chair of the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Haifa, and who also was the author of an acta published by our center. This is the acta, you can have it here, on ignorance, respect and suspicion, current Japanese attitudes towards Jews, and has also recently published an article that's relevant, I think, to our discussion on Tokyo recognizes Auschwitz, the rise and fall of Holocaust denial in Japan, 1989 to 1999.
I'm always delighted to return here to the Hebrew University, my alma mater, and I'm thankful for this invitation and the honor to be here tonight. This goes to my first teacher who introduced me to Japan, Professor Benjamin Shivoni, and to Professor Robert District, the head of the Vidal Sassoon Center, with whom I had the privilege to work in the past. While I am fortunate to be here tonight, and probably misfortunate to be the last one to talk, I had before me these two pillars of the research on the Japanese and the Jews. As you noticed, probably there are explicit differences between them, and I will try in this presentation to give not a summary, but to bridge between their views. I'd like also to thank Professor Goodman for his panoramic and well-researched presentation. Although it deals ostensibly with a narrowly defined topic, this paper touches a much broader setting. In the last decade, we have benefited greatly from Professor Goodman's insights on the Japanese attitude towards the Jews. His seminal book, Jews in the Japanese Mind, is a true landmark in this field and an indispensable reading to anyone who studies Japanese attitude to the other in general and foreigners in particular. I want to emphasize today the broader context because the whole concept of Jews in Japan and the derivative anti-Semitism, but also philo-Semitism, are indeed a peculiar phenomenon. As it was represented earlier, I would just like to repeat some of the points. Japan lacks most of the sources and causes that characterize anti-Semitic attitudes in other nations. Let me mention a few of them. First, anti-Semitism in Japan has not evolved from any encounter with Jews. The Jewish community in Japan consists these days about a little more than 1,000 members. And the Japanese do not, virtually cannot distinguish between Jews and other Western residents. Japanese anti-Semitism does not have long roots. It started only in the 20th century. Similarly, it does not have any religious roots. Anti-Semitism in Japan has never gained a fully governmental support, nor it become a national ideology. It has neither developed because of the significant conflict between Israel and Japan, as we find in certain Arab or Muslim countries. In fact, anti-Semitism has never penetrated the lower classes in Japan, nor it had any popular support. Finally, it has appeared almost only in a written form and never deteriorated to the realm of damage or to material or physical attacks on Jews. The Jews, as you probably understood, are basically imaginary figures. To add to the vivid examples Professor Shironi brought before, I will just tell you that when I used to present myself in Japan as an Israeli, usually drew some distance, some often even repulsion, because Israel is associated with the Middle East, quite a backward area. But if I would prefer to designate myself, to define myself as a Jewish person, as a Jew, it would draw much warmer comments, and the first one would be, Tamagai, it means you are probably smart. You do pay more than we pay to similar attitude in other East Asian nations. Professor Goodman has always emphasized the context of the Japanese attitudes to Jews, and even the title of his book, Jews in the Japanese Mind, stresses these unilateral relations. That is, the Jews have by far greater role in the Japanese cultural and national discourse than the Japanese have had in the Jewish discourse. Well, there are several explanations. The first one, we heard it today, is the emulation and imitation of leading culture, the rise of anti-Semitism in Japan, and the emergence of the protocols can be viewed as a mere emulation of foreign trends and fads. The attraction for the protocols was related originally to an anti-communist white Russian fascination. The first wave of anti-Semitic writings during the 30s and the 40s was emulation of German writings. And even the recent wave of anti-Semitic writings in the latter half of the 80s is an echo, probably, of a global surge in anti-Semitism elsewhere. Jews also displace xenophobic feelings towards foreigners in general. Some observers have suggested that the Japanese anti-Jewish phenomenon is actually an indirect way of expressing resentment against foreigners in general. Citing the rising number of legal and illegal workers during the recession period reignited Japanese xenophobia. One example used to support this theory is a demonstration held in Tokyo in the spring of 1993 by ultra-right-wing groups who used Nazi swastikas on the posters when calling for the expulsion of illegal immigrants. Jews also reflect the image of Israel and the stance of Japan toward the Arab world. The image of the Jews may have been affected by the negative image of Israel in the last 40-50 years. Jews also related to the way Japanese interpret their own nation. Jews are used to facilitate internal needs. They serve as a beacon of Japan's quest for self-definition, as an explanation for Japan's current problem. This discourse, which goes probably for about 100 years, is known as Nihonjinron, the theories or discussions about Japan or Japaneseness. This argument seems useful when dealing with several issues. First of all, by discussing the Jews, there is a kind of reinforcement of sense of uniqueness. Since their early history, as a nation, the Japanese have invoked and manipulated images of foreigners, often far from reality, but in accordance with certain social and political agenda, in order to define their own identity. Jews, in this sense, served as a quintessential other, which contrasts the Japanese in any of their traits. One example is Yamamoto Shichie, publisher and a writer, and his famous book, the most famous book, The Japanese and the Jews, a bestseller in 1970. Yamamoto continued earlier trends of treating the Jews as the archetype of the other, facilitated comfortable course for other Nihonjin theorists to keep comparing the Japanese with the Jews. Jews can also serve as an explanation for economic distress, and therefore we can see that the new wave of anti-Semitic writings began in the key period of the beginning of economic problems in the end of the 80s and beginning of the 90s. There is another issue here which should be mentioned, which is unrelated neither to the Jews nor to the Japanese, and this is demand and supply. Side by side with national needs and psychological motives, there may be additional factors. One is that I think is the commercial success. The outlandish commercial success of Yamamoto's Japanese and the Jews was sold in more than 1 million copies, led to a wave of publication, partially because the topic appeared to be a golden mine for publishers and flexible writers. The supply of books have attracted new writers and new readership that previously may have no idea about this topic. Last one is attraction to occultism. I have the feeling that in Japan it's maybe stronger than in other places. The interest in Jews is due to their image as a small and secluded group which influences and controls world affairs. There is in Japan exceptional interest in occultism, supernatural phenomena, and wide range of conspiracies. Within this milieu, the Jews, as unfamiliar and legendary people, play the role of world manipulators. In 1995-1996, I conducted a wide survey among university students, almost more than 500 students, and this survey confirmed only some of these aspects. My reading of the success of anti-Semitic literature suggests, and here I quote what I have written about 9 years ago, that it is associated with the traditionally sinister image of the Jews. The Japanese perceive them as a small group, often smaller than it is in reality, of detached and asocial people. Even young Japanese possess a deep-seated image of the Jews, even though it may be unconscious as a group which conspires to harm others. This notion is encouraged by attraction to occult writing and by an old belief in the threat on Japan posed by foreign powers. End quote. The protocol in this sense combined both long-term demonization of Jews, already more than 80 years in Japan, with an occult image of a sinister group that clandestinely gathered and planned to rule the world. It is really not important, as Ota, one of the Japanese mentioned here before, it is not really important, as he admitted, if the book is genuine. The belief in the existence of such a manipulated group is currently stronger than any refutation. It also served by far more important and unrelated goals than none of the authors of the original manuscript could imagine, the Russian authors. The next question is what is the impact of the protocols? I have only a short comment here. There have been various views on the actual significance of the Japanese anti-Semitic writings and their impact on the Japanese society. They range from alarmist fears to calm sarcasm over this phenomenon. Some specialists argue that the Japanese anti-Semitism led to Jewish hatred and anti-Israeli views, while others suggest that it is a marginal phenomenon that may even reinforce positive images of a successful group, as we heard today, thereby providing Jews and the state of Israel some credit they not necessarily deserve. My own reading of the impact of this phenomenon is that the exposure to anti-Semitic literature does not lead to substantial shift in perception of the Jewish image, but it tends to slightly underscore its positive and negative facets. In some cases, and for some individuals, it may lead to suspicion and distrust, while for others, it may lead to admiration and even benefits. The majority, let's face it, the majority of Japanese are ignorant of the protocols and unaware of the long legacy of anti-Semitism in the world and in Japan. At the same time, here may be the final point, I believe that the long, intensive writings, long period of a wave of writings, and I don't know how much you can imagine that in the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, there were bookshops in the very wide scale Japanese bookshops with bookshelves of Jewish literature. The Jewish shelf was such an important issue. So, after a long exposure and during a long, intensive wave of writings, it may slowly affect public opinion in a negative way. This is my opinion. Finally, how can we change the situation, or simply, is there anything we can do about it? Since the emergence of the recent anti-Semitic wave in Japan, there have been various attempts of Jewish organizations to halt it. The most fruitful activities took place during the Marco Polo affair, which arguably led to the demise. The Marco Polo affair was the publication of a Holocaust denial article, Auschwitz did not exist, in January 1995, exactly by chance the same month of the Om Shinikyo attack on the subway. And arguably this campaign against this Holocaust denial writings led to the demise of the journal. There are different interpretations about it, and to more importantly, a public debate about the issue. Professor Goodman justly criticized at that time the Japanese failure to engage foreigners in an open debate and conducting, I'm quoting here, an intense, solipsistic monologue about Jews and anti-Semitism. He also contended at that time that such a reaction was typical of the way many Japanese have dealt with the outside world for centuries. While I agree with him in these points, I still think that it was a breakthrough in 1995, the whole debate about the Jewish writing and the Jewish place in the Japanese mind. I still think it was a breakthrough in the Japanese intellectual treatment of this issue in the last 20 years. The Jewish reaction and the Japanese response to it provide some insights for future dealings with Holocaust denial activities and the broader phenomenon of so-called intellectual anti-Semitism in countries with limited acquaintance with Jews, such as Japan. First, any defense against anti-Semitism requires a body that surveys the media, and warns of any expression of anti-Semitism. One of the reasons Japanese politicians and the media repeatedly express ethnocentric one of the reasons that the Japanese media and various politicians express ethnocentric prejudice against foreigners and often even racist remarks is their intrinsic belief that foreigners cannot read or understand them because of language difficulties. The success of the Jewish campaign, after almost a decade of feeble and futile protests, suggests that appealing to editors and publishers' goodwill is ineffective, since they are often interested in well-published scandals and consequently higher sales. Also, leaving sporadic cases of anti-Semitic writings without a response, waiting for a local media to react does not solve the problem, but stimulate interest and demand for further publications. While I do believe that the full solution to the tide of anti-Semitic writings lies mostly in internal factors within the Japanese society, unrelated to the Jews or Israel, the most efficient way to deal with it is to launch fully orchestrated operations that combine the use of Japanese and foreign media, criticism of well-known foreign personalities, political intervention, and even economic sanctions. When all are realized, as happened in the Marco Polo affair briefly, we may witness the continuation of a slow change, positive change, until some may sardonically add another group emerges as a scapegoat. Thank you very much.
I'm holding in my hand the Japanese, which was written by myself upside down, written by myself, which must prove something. I'm not quite sure what it proves, but it certainly proves an interest in the subject, which may be, of course, more ambiguous than it seems at first sight. But here we are. This book has been translated into Japanese.
As far as books in Japanese are concerned, in addition to Professor Wistrich's volume, I should say that I in my book, was very critical of the Japanese intellectual community for its response to this deluge of books about the Jews in the mid-1980s. And I said so in my book. And I'm happy to report that although the Japanese scholars have remained very reticent to address this phenomenon head-on and engage in public criticism of Uno Masami or any of these other authors, they have responded by producing quite a large number of very serious studies of Jews, a large number of translations of good and scholarly works of Western literature on the Jews in a variety of subjects, everything from the Mishnah to the Holocaust. And so I think in general the response of the Japanese intellectual community has been to avoid direct polemical engagement and instead to produce countervailing kinds of materials. And in this I think they've been quite successful. And the number and quality of Japanese scholars of Judaism, the Middle East situation, and sociologists of all kinds of liturgy, of Yiddish, the sheer number of these people has increased, and the quality of them is really quite good. So on that score, is good. As far as the impact of Arab oil and so forth, I think that there have been, this is a big topic, and I don't think we got time to, it's a little bit off the subject that I was addressing. in 1973, at the time of the Arab oil embargo, Japan was very vulnerable to Arab oil, was very dependent upon oil from the Middle East and very vulnerable to Arab oil pressure. And they were, because they're very bright and think far ahead and are think strategically, Japan is in a much better position today. It has strategic reserves, it has alternative sources, it knows how to play the spot market much better than it did in those days. And so it's not much less vulnerable to pressure, this kind of so-called oil blackmail. In addition, I think Japan was very, very upset with what happened during the 1991 Gulf War. Japan was accused of dithering, of not participating, and then of what was called checkbook diplomacy. By some accounts, the Japanese paid as much as $17 billion toward the cost of the war, which was essentially what the war cost. So they wound up paying for the war, but at the same time being criticized for not having participated and being labeled checkbook diplomats. They were misled badly by the so-called Middle East scholars of Japan at the time, who appeared 24 hours a day on the television and couldn't get anything right. They misconstrued and misunderstood what was happening in every detail, and I was there and I watched them on television. The Japanese government was totally misinformed, at least by the public intellectuals, of what was happening. And in the aftermath, I think that Professor Shimoni can either confirm this or correct me, but it seems to me that relations with Israel changed. The relationship with the Palestinians in the aftermath has changed quite considerably. So I think that Japan, while in the 70s and 80s had a sort of were Arab leaning in their policies because of oil and because of the influence of the left, in the period since the first Gulf War, I think the Japanese have become less susceptible to oil pressure and less sympathetic with the Palestinians, although they continue to try to keep a balanced relationship. It's less favorable to the Arab side. I'll stop there and let my colleagues answer some of these other questions.
That is, and it's also influential in some circles, and of course Goodman also mentioned, there are some parts of the extreme left, of radical students, who became anti-Israel, but in a large extent also anti-Semitic, because of this Arab Palestinian left-wing literature, which says that Israel and the Jews are partner and pluralism and that to Asia that things. So there is an influence, but it's the whole left is now losing influence in Japan, and the extreme left is not what it used to be. I think this danger is decreasing, but I would say that the new left in Japan, maybe more than the right, became anti-Semitic, or at least used anti-Semitism in its propaganda and its ideology. Now, powerful books to fight anti-Semitism. Again, this question is based on the assumption that these books are really anti-Semitic, and what is needed is to refute them. But first of all, the Japanese don't regard these books as anti-Semitic. Most of them are anti-Semitic. They regard them sometimes as being very praising the Jews. And as I said, this book by Fujita Den, it became a huge bestseller, one of the greatest bestsellers. Maybe it even sold more than Uno Masani. It was translated into Korean, into Chinese. It became bestseller in Korea. It became bestseller in China. Because everyone in East Asia wants to know the Jewish business practices. Because everyone wants to succeed in business nowadays in East Asia. So to have such a book, for a little small amount of money, you can learn how to be a good businessman. So it's like a manual for being a good businessman. So, of course, there are people who say in the Israel embassy, they always say, maybe we ask some Japanese to write another book, who say, how, refute all these things. Some people wrote such books, but it didn't sell at all. Because people like to read these conspiracy books. They don't like to read books that refute conspiracy. If you write a book that says that Nostradamus' prophecies are really wrong, nobody will buy the book. So, the question is not who will write the book, but who will buy the book. As you asked about the Holocaust. Oh yes, the Japanese were very much interested in the Holocaust. And for instance, you take the diary of Anne Frank. It was a huge bestseller. And it still sells in Japan. I think there are more Japanese people who read the diary of Anne Frank than Israelis. And this book is more known in Japan. If you just ask your students here who read this book, and ask in Japan who read this book, you find more Japanese who read the diary of Anne Frank. And Japanese need of Arab oil, of course it affected attitude toward Israel very much. Because, if you were a Japanese businessman or a Japanese government official that your country needs the Arab oil, you cannot be blamed for doing everything to keep that oil. But did it influence the students? Of course not. Because the students were influenced by the propaganda of the New Left in the West, and the Palestinians, whereas the businessmen were, of course, interested by the need of oil. Now, protocols killed people in Japan. I think Professor Goodman meant it in a very figurative way. He didn't really mean that the protocols killed the Japanese. Because, Aum Shinrikyo, their enemies, great enemies, the Japanese government, Japanese establishment, and the United States, and all the Western governments, and the Jews. So we are part of the whole world that Aum Shinrikyo hates. But after Aum Shinrikyo did these things, he didn't do it against the Jews. He never thought of hurting Jews in Japan. He did it against Japanese government officials was fighting the government. After they didn't, and after they were suppressed and they were outlawed as an organization, they were broken up. Now they reorganized. They were allowed to reorganize. And of course, they had to choose another name. Aum Shinrikyo was abolished. It had to be abolished. The government would not allow it to come back. So they said, okay, we'll call ourselves another name. Now you have so many words in the Japanese language that you can use. You know what they choose? Aleph. The Hebrew word Aleph. Not Alpha, the Greek word, that's Aleph. Not because they didn't know it. They chose it because they knew it's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Which shows that they have this respect. On the other hand, they have all this anti-Semitic literature. On the other hand, they have a great respect for Jewish culture and want to call themselves by a Jewish name. Would you think of any Western anti-Semitic group calling itself Aleph? So, I don't think that you should be afraid that Aum Shinrikyo are going to kill Jews in Japan or in the world. They are, in this sense, the one who has to fear among them is the Japanese government, of course. And the Japanese government does not fear anymore the Aum Shinrikyo, because I think the whole thing is blown out, and the leader, Asahara Shoko, got death sentences, I think it's the end of what used to be Aum Shinrikyo.
Observed, Professor Shaloni and I have slightly differing views, and I just want to underscore the difference a little bit. I did not mean that the protocol's influence on Aum was figurative. I meant it literally. I think that there's quite a lot of textual evidence that they took the protocols literally and they acted on them. I would like to. I think that Aum was very serious about trying to save the world. And, Robert Lifton wrote a book about Om, and he titled it "Destroying the World to Save It." This kind of millenarian impulse. They were quite serious about it. They were not unsophisticated. These were people with Tokyo University education. I think that I don't have time today to talk about it, but there's a parallel with the attack in 1972, May 30th, when the Red Army disembarked at Blood Airport and shot up the disembarkation lobby. They also believed that they were trying to save the world through world revolution, and killing Jews was somehow a method to do this. The part that I think is figurative or metaphorical is the fact that Om was killing metaphorical Jews. They defined these people in the subway as somehow part of this world Jewish conspiracy, just as they did in the slide that I showed. I'm not talking figuratively. What I'm saying is, well, I can give you another example. On April 20th, 1995, Timothy McVeigh drove up in front of the Oklahoma City Federal Building in Oklahoma City in a truck loaded with fuel oil and fertilizer, and he set it up. He exploded it. He blew up the building and killed 168 people. And he modeled his actions on a novel called The Turner Diaries. I'm sure you're familiar, you've heard of this. The Turner Diaries is a fictional account based on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is an incitement to murder. And whether this document, whether you do it now, you do it later, the fact that it at one point or another, my view is that sooner or later somebody is going to act out this fantasy, and it's happened over and over again, and it's happened in the United States. It's not only in Japan. I don't see why we should think that somehow this is because it happens in Japan. It's cute or amusing. I don't think it's funny, and I don't take it. Maybe I'm overly serious about this, but I think that everything that Professor Shalomi said was true. But I think I specifically wanted, in my paper, I avoided using the word anti-Semitism, because I think that we should separate the question of anti-Semitism from the question of whether, how the Protocols is used, how it's construed, and whether or not it leads to acts of violence. I think that the overwhelming evidence is that the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, whether it's in Japan or the United States or Argentina or anywhere else, leads to mass murder. And I don't see any evidence to the contrary. I just came from a 2.5-day conference in Tel Aviv where paper after paper after paper documented this. And I simply don't agree with Professor Shalomi that this is cute.
Well, as for the books, there is certainly very wide, a lot of literature, serious literature about the history of the Jews, anti-Semitism, the Holocaust in Japan. And just coming back from a 3-month stay in Japan, and in most of the libraries I visited, I couldn't find any anti-Semitic literature, but also only serious literature, so-called serious literature. At the same time, this serious literature has probably remained the domain of scholars, while this simplistic anti-Semitic writing is what the ordinary layman reads when he goes to work. So here comes the question of which literature is more influential, and what can we look for to counter it. In fact, the question could be, what do we want? A correct image, if there is such a thing, or a useful image? And from another view, maybe could be the whole issue is, from at least a Jewish perspective, how dangerous is the image. I would like to go back to the figures Professor Shiloni gave before. Only 20% are familiar with the anti-Semitic literature. This means 25 million people. Out of them, only 6% have changed their mind. I mean, their opinion deteriorated. This means 1.5 million. This is a lot of people. 1.5 million.
Excluding children.
Okay. And the illiterate, of course. And among this, it's enough several hundreds, or even tens of people, only a few tens, but to make an attack on the Lord Airport. I don't want to link the two issues, but could be. Or the attack on the Tokyo subway. And therefore, this image is a negative image, and the question is how can we change it? I don't have here any constructive suggestion beyond what I said before, and clearly this is a long process that cannot be solved by one book, one decisive book that will change decades of negative writing. Finally, as for the Japanese government stance and the Israeli policy, I think there is a very limited link between the anti-Semitic writing and the Israeli stance. You can see it, especially after 1991, when the policy vis-à-vis Israel became much more positive. At the same time, anti-Semitic writings were on the rise. The Japanese government at the same time did not do anything to prevent these writings, either legally or by any other influence. And clearly, the negative policies against Israel during several decades could have been a fertile ground for readership of anti-Semitic literature. Thank you very much.
First of all, thanking our three participants. We had a very rich, diverse set of viewpoints. Some of the differences became clearer, more defined in answer to some of these questions. But I think that it's a very varied kaleidoscope question of whether or not this anti-Semitism, any form of anti-Semitism, especially the protocols of the Order of Zion, could, under some circumstances, be more, or I hesitate to use the word benign. I don't believe it can ever be benign, as Professor Goodman suggested, but certainly there is a different take on it, a different section in Japan that we have learned about. I want especially to thank Professor Goodman, who was our particular guest in the board, for having presented, I think, a very worthwhile and important presentation, which will require us to think more deeply about the question of the protocols. And our two respondents, who both provided very stimulating responses. The audience, especially the hardcore that has rested with us to this moment, deserves to applaud itself. And I would like to thank the staff of the Centre for once again having provided us with a very stimulating evening. And we will think and chew over these issues. Thank you very much.